Good morning and welcome. This is Pacifica Graduate Institute's Experience Day. I'm Joe Cambray. I'm the President and CEO of Pacifica Graduate Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this day where we're going to have a chance to show you a little bit about where we're at Pacifica as you're considering graduate school. And we want to talk with you about graduate school in the 21st century as we're really moving ahead, especially in this unprecedented time of great suffering and transformation that's happening not only locally, but culturally and globally. We've been going through ourselves an enormous learning experience over the last 4.5 months as we've moved to a more remote format for the time being. I want to be clear, our goal is to get back to our residential experience classrooms. But we are, in the meantime, moving forward with a very robust and upgraded online presence right now to get us through. We're going to stay online through the end of the fall, through December 31st. That's where our creditors have agreed. For the winter, we're still looking at best options. We may move to a hybrid model where that is some people come to campus and some have a chance to see this remotely. We're trying to optimize that right now, and we're waiting for some of the federal agencies to give us a little bit clearer guidance. So that's something that's going to be an ongoing uncertainty that we all live in, and throughout the entire country, throughout the entire world. But let's talk a little bit about what's been happening. Some of the changes, not only are we using Zoom like we're doing here, and that's fraught with a lot of things. We know about Zoom fatigue, and we have to change the pacing of how we do things, the way we deliver content, both synchronous like this and asynchronous, where there's a chance to do things online, but at your own leisure and at your own pace. And so we're blending those together and optimizing those. We're upgrading our learning management system that delivers content and allows for all of those options. We're examining the best practices in pedagogy that go with this. And so in a way, it's an opportunity. It's a crisis and it's an opportunity. And that's really what we're trying to begin to reflect the deepest way we can. I mean, we're a school that comes out of the traditions of depth psychology. That is a psychology that says that there's an unconscious dimension to human life, whether it's individual or group or collective in various scales. And ultimately, it's a holistic approach. And so what we want to combine is a holistic, systemic approach to learning itself, to the very subject matter that we offer. And that gets us to questions of contemporary culture and what's happening right now, including the things that people don't want to look at, the levels of denial, whether it be about the danger of the pandemic that we're in, the serious concerns that we all have that flood the newspaper on a daily basis, or whether it's systemic racism, as we've seen, not only overt acts, but the way systems are embedded in this. And we're taking a very deep dive and look at that here at Pacifica right now. We're in the midst of that. And there's actions that are coming out of that we're in the process of preparing for announcing. And then there's also climate change, another area where people have wanted to deny it because they confuse weather and climate. Climate is the larger scale. Weather is what you see every day. Climate is the deep patterns that evolve over time. And all of those things have a deep psychological base. And that's what Pacifica will educate you to look more closely at those kinds of things. And it has immediate practical implications, such as, for those interested in our counseling or clinical programs, there's the implication of how we were going to deliver services. So what we've decided to do is to train you. If you're in one of those programs, I'm going to show you. Here's an image. I got this yesterday. It's just a newspaper for psychologists, the National Psychologists. It's their summer 2020. And I want you to see the top headline: Psychologists pivot to teletherapy as pandemic takes hold. Well, that's partly driven because insurance companies in America, for the first time ever, have opened up the possibility of insurance payments for teletherapy. So those interested in clinical training and clinical practice, this is a part of our future. And to be honest, I think what we're seeing in terms of the American workforce, there is a huge transformation underway about moving to remote forms of practice of all sorts. That many, many more people now are beginning to consider how to do remote work from home or from a home office. And so, well, we would prefer to have us all on campus, and I'd dearly love to see you here. This is usually an event that happens on one of our 2 campuses. In the interim, what we are going to do is to train you to be really top in your field in being able to work either remotely or via telecommunications one way or another, so that you really are prepared to enter that world. And let me say a little bit also in terms of the look at depth psychology. I mentioned systemic racism, whether it's embedded in theories, there's a lot of good, but there's a lot of reconsideration. I think we're finding that our models of the mind are moving to a much more ecologically based model. That is, we see interconnectedness between people. We could think of it even like a rhizomatic model. Rhizomes are plants that you know, like bamboo and ginger and aspen trees and so forth, where there's huge connections under the ground, and then you have individuals that look like separate individuals, plants that blossom and flower, but they're really part of a much deeper below ground network. And the mind seems to truly be like that. It's not so local and it's more distributed. So that brings us close to the indigenous traditions around the world, the way they have conceived of large spirit in terms of the land itself and the interactions of the people and the animals and the plants within the landscape. Well, that's a profound, deep ecology that we're looking at there. And it has enormous ethical and moral implications that, that we are going to discuss at length here at Pacifica. In fact, I think you'll hear some of it from our speaker, our keynote speaker this morning, Mary Watkins, but give me a minute for that. So, how to live locally and interact globally. That's really part of the challenge that the entire community is facing. And, you know, we're now in an information age and we're overloaded. Our society is information rich to the point we all have psychic indigestion from all of the information. That's part of the Zoom fatigue. I mean, all of you are in different locales looking at me in this locale, and when I bring on the next speaker, that'll be somebody sitting in yet a different environment. And our psyches are not evolved to just move throughout all these environments. It's a bit of metabolism that has to happen to really be able to digest that and to be able to find our way forward in all of this. So with that, I want to just say we're part of a worldwide community that's forming. That's part of what we're really learning about this crisis. Just one very quick anecdote. I do a lot of work in China. It's obviously now through telecommunications. And when this first started, I was working with a group on dreams throughout various places in China. And I talked with them about some of the research around the changes in air quality that were happening, because as countries were shutting down, the air pollution began to drop. And one of the participants suddenly became very emotional, and we stopped and talked with her about that. And what she revealed was that she now understood she had a huge wave of nostalgia that came up as I was talking. And what she said is she realized what happened. She had gone outside a couple of days before and felt tremendous sadness, and she didn't understand why. And now, as I talked about it, she said, the sky was so blue. It's been 10 years since I've seen a sky that blue. And so there was a kind of shock, and actually it brought us forward as a group, across cultural barriers, to talk about what we're all suffering in this over-polluted, sort of over, sort of smogged filled environment, and what we're seeing, what the virus may open our eyes to. and really help us see, do we want to just go back status quo ante, or do we really need to go through a deeper transformation? And so that's part of what we'd like to invite you into. And during that, this is, as a time of crisis, it is an archetypal moment. So we would expect the kinds of things with an archetypal shift to appear there, even sometimes coincidences that I'd call synchronicities. So with that, I want to move now and pass the baton here to our provost, Dr. Peter Rojcewicz. He'll have a few more words, and then we'll move on with the morning. So Peter, please.
Thank you, Joe. Good morning. I'm Peter Rojcewicz, the provost here at Pacifica Graduate Institute. People are carefully thinking about educational possibilities during this time of radical uncertainty, and they hope to strategically find their way through a world of increasing complexity and rapid, unpredictable change. And at Pacifica, we are doing exactly that. We're preparing people through our educational curricula to grasp the warp and woof of our unique times: paradox, chaos, liminality, asymmetry, emergence, and synchronicity. And to that end, we're fashioning our curriculum and pedagogy to support people to develop a number of adaptive psychosocial skills that include frustration tolerance, cognitive flexibility, resilience, response ableness, and even copelessness. That is, the capacity to be truly open and present to what emerges in the moment. Rather than forging and formulating our academic curricula along separate and distinct academic disciplines, which is more suited for a world that is long past us, Pacifica favors holism and systems thinking, emphasizing transdisciplinarity, focusing on interdependence and process and in fields and contexts and relations. So why Pacifica now, you're thinking? To help people navigate a turbulent world, each of our degree programs is rooted in depth psychology, since self-knowledge is a prerequisite for all forms of knowing the world. And our programs study the unconscious mind that is itself characterized by the very unique features of the world that we're living in now: uncertainty, oppositions. The unconscious is defined by non-rationality, compensation, shadow, and self-organization. And all this is expressed in dreams, imagination, myth, and synchronicities. There is a deep imperative at the heart of Pacifica's own self-understanding mission, and that is to preserve the connection between knowledge and the zest for life by uniting what is traditional in education with what is emerging currently in the world as part of an imaginative reconsideration of learning. This self-development mission of Pacifica strives to develop people capable of never succumbing to a feeling of futility or the belief that they have come to an end of what is worth doing, knowing, or being. And we do this by focusing upon the imagination. And we have a sense of the imagination in two ways: the instrumental imagination that grasps the objective and mechanistic possibilities and processes of human behavior, but also the empathic imagination, the ability to enter into, to feel into, and live inside the inner life of other people, other events, of even objects. Walt Whitman once wrote, "There was a child went forth every day And the first object he looked upon, that object he became, and that object became part of him. I invite you today to join our intentional community at Pacifica. Join us as we forge a new myth of learning, that calls us into a deeper awareness and passion for the very act of living itself in the world as it is. Thank you.
Hello and welcome again to the Pacifica Experience Day. My name is Jessica Rubenstein. I am the Assistant Director of Admissions Coordination here at Pacifica Graduate Institute. Just a few technical notes. If you look at the top right-hand corner of your screen, there is a speaker view or gallery view option. Gallery view will show you all the current panelists on the talk today. However, if you click speaker view, you can just see who is speaking at the time. So a few notes about today. First of all, because you are attending this event, we are waiving our $75 application fee to apply to our programs today. So if you go to the link on the landing page for this event and you scroll down, there is a free application link under the section that says application for enrollment. All you do is click the link. You'll give some of your information such as name, address, phone number, and program. Click submit, and then you'll apply for free. And then after that, you can begin submitting your application documents such as personal statement, letters of recommendation, writing sample to applicant@pacifica.edu. And if you have any other questions about that, if you scroll all the way down on the landing page, you'll see the advisor information by program. So if you haven't spoken to an advisor yet, I would definitely recommend you do so. We have advisors for each program. You can feel free to call or email them at any time, and they'll get back to you as soon as possible. A quick overview of today. We are going to have our featured speaker today, which is Dr. Mary Watkins. And then after that, we are going to have program breakout sessions, and we're going to have two. So if you're torn between two programs, or you just want to attend another one just for fun, we are going to have two breakout sessions today. And after this talk, you will go to the landing page and click the link to the breakout session of your choice based on the program or programs you're interested in. Also, all the talks today will be recorded. So there will be a link sent out in the next week or two if you miss one of the sessions or you just want to listen to later. And also the last session of the day will be a student services panel. So if you have some questions for admissions, financial aid, or our student affairs department, that's a great chance to get to meet some of us and ask any questions you might have. Any questions that aren't answered today, you can feel free to reach out to admissions@pacifica.edu, and we can forward the question to the appropriate person if it needs to, or we can answer it ourselves. So going forward, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker today. Her name is Dr. Mary Watkins. She is the chair of our CLIE program, Community Liberation, Indigenous, and Eco-Psychologies program. And the title of the talk today is Keeping the Door Open in a Time of Walling In and Walling Out, Pandemics, Policing, Prisons, and Forced Migration. And I'll turn it over to Mary right now. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I want to really warmly welcome you to Pacifica today in the virtual mode that we're in. I think you've chosen a really interesting time to consider rerouting yourself into your education and your learning process. I know that since the pandemic struck and all the challenges that we've faced since then, it's been a steep learning curve for me. I want to share with you some of the things I have been learning this year and really recommend to you that one of the anchors during such an unprecedented moment is to engage in education, and education to prepare for the many kinds of changes and transformations that we need in our society and in our own consciousness. So I want to begin by just telling you a little bit about myself. I was trained as a clinical psychologist and worked as a clinical psychologist for about 20 years, and then was very influenced by a movement called liberation psychology, which really appealed to psychologists to be involved in what I call the public practice of psychology. We know about the private practice in terms of individual sessions with people, which can be crucially important at different points in our lives. But what we don't focus adequately enough on is the need for psychologically minded people to engage in the social and cultural challenges and ecological challenges that we're facing. And toward the end of my talk today, I want to bring attention to what some of our alums and students are doing with regard to some of the issues that I'll be talking about today. For the last 20 years, I've been working on issues related to the US-Mexico border. And after a few years of that work, I became convinced that we would not be building a border wall if we were not already living the kinds of borders and walls within our own communities. Just a second, I see that I'm on the wrong slide. Let me get here. And I want to bring us back to a very important insight of Frantz Fanon, a liberation psychiatrist. He says, I want the world to recognize with me the open door of every consciousness. That quote has been a sort of guiding star for me as I've worked on issues within my own community, Santa Barbara, across ethnicity. And I want us to hold it in mind as I gather some of the strands of my talk today. I'm going to begin telling you about a day before the pandemic. I was driving back from Adelanto ICE Detention Center, which is a prison for people seeking asylum in the US. It's to the east of LA and holds 2,000 people and is scheduled to expand to hold even more. This kind of holding center, which is really a prison, has proliferated across the United States. This was a map before the latest building of the new centers. There isn't yet a map of that map, but you can see how the issues at the border, the literal border of the US, are now all over our communities as we have built prisons to contain those who are seeking safe passage into our country. So at the beginning of the present administration, I made a commitment to train myself to do psychological and forensic evaluations of asylum seekers who were in detention centers, hoping that that work could help to speed people's release. And I go to Adelanto before the pandemic. I was going every other week to talk to one or two people. And on my way home, it's about a 3-hour drive to Santa Barbara. I have a chance to think back over what people have been speaking to me about. And the particular day I'm going to mention before the pandemic, I had spoken to 2 different people who were both pro-democracy activists in their own country, and they had been imprisoned. They had been tortured. The woman had been raped by a group of military police, and they took her for dead. They had her in the bushes. They took her for dead, and they continued to rape her after they thought she was dead. She also conveyed how the military guards in the detention center in her home country had forced her to eat her only piece of bread of the day with human excrement on it. And I was mulling over in my mind, coming to grips with the kind of brutality and violence that these two people had suffered, first in their home country and then on their travels from Africa to Brazil to Colombia, up through El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, and then to be turned away at our border because the administration said that the US was full. And so they each had to stay in Tijuana for 6 to 8 months waiting for a chance to seek asylum in the US with no money, no safe place to stay. So I was thinking about this kind of interpersonal and societal violence that people have to, that comes to mark and mar their precious existence. And then on the radio, I was listening to the news. It was a day that the present administration was, had a success, and I put quotation marks around that, in lifting environmental rules that disallowed corporations and factories from dispelling heavy metals and toxic waste into American streams and rivers. So I was holding these two kinds of violence, one against the natural world, and then ultimately against animals and human beings whose lives are utterly dependent upon fresh and clean water, and the violence against these asylum seekers. When a word began to make its way into my mind from many, many years ago, decades ago, when I was reading Erich Fromm, and that word was necrophilia. And I'm going to introduce you to some of how he described necrophilia. He was trying to, which means the love of death. He was trying to come to grips with what had happened in Germany during the Holocaust, and particularly in the last moments of World War II, when Hitler, knowing that in fact Germany was going to lose, put out a call for farmhouses and fields to be burned, German museums to be sacked. That was to destroy everything. So he describes this necrophilic character orientation, which I began to think was really at the basis of both the situation with the river and the situation at Adelanto, as a passionate attraction to all that is dead, decayed, putrid, sickly. It's the passion to transform that which is alive into something unalive, to destroy for the sake of destruction. It's an exclusive interest in all that is mechanical. It is the passion to tear apart living structures. Necrophiliacs have the conviction that the only way to solve a problem of conflict is by force and violence. And I invite you to hold these quotes next to the kinds of issues that we see unfolding in our own country today. For necrophiliacs, the past is sacred. Nothing new is valuable. Drastic change is a crime against the natural order. natural being in quotes, i.e. that's which we come to believe is natural, but which of course is created. Necrophiliacs feel empty, and so they attempt to hoard, to consume, and amass excess wealth and power, to fill a sense of emptiness with sadism and aggression. He understood the necrophilic orientation to be the most malignant form of authoritarian or sadomasochistic character structures. And in The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, he describes people with that orientation as those with an intense desire to control, hurt, and humiliate others, as excessively narcissistic. For the narcissist, he says, there's only one reality, and that is his own thought processes, feelings, and needs. Indeed, none of the kind of empathic imagination that Peter just emphasized. They conspicuously consume acquisitions, conquests, and victories. As malignantly aggressive, they describe all their opponents as losers, attempting to humiliate and insult them. They're vengefully destructive, encouraging violence, particularly in the face of losing. Authoritarian populism or neo-fascism appeals to parts of a society that tend toward necrophilia, who wish to restore an idealized past, who are suspicious of government intervention, who are racist, who aspire to the power and control of the leader, who do not see interdependently, as Joe was underscoring, believing that they must tend to their own survival and freedom that is not seen as linked to others, a complete disavowal of the rhizomelic realities that we exist in. So in the US, this kind of orientation has been linked to a very severe and probably pathological form of radical individualism, where forms of collective solidarity are held suspect, and as we're seeing unfold in the streets of Portland, even held as criminal, where government interventions to curb and regulate issues that mitigate against the common good are rejected as un-American and unfair, as intruding upon personal liberty. The chosen philosopher for many of those who hold this perspective is the novelist Ayn Rand, whose books you may or may not have read in high school, books like Fountainhead. And she says, government is bad, selfishness is good. Watch out for yourself. Solidarity is a trap. Taxes are theft. You are not the bosses of me. So in particular, efforts to bridle unregulated capitalism, to rein in egregious income inequalities that result in healthcare, housing, and education inequalities, from this philosophy are seen as intrusions into rights for liberty. The victims are paradoxically seen as those who are interrupted from pursuing their own aims when they conflict with others. The victims are not seen as the very ones who are harmed by the inequalities. So that day, when I got back from Adelanto and I went to my bookshelf, I pulled out my Fromm books, that the page is quite yellow because I was reading them intensely in my 20s and 30s. And then the pandemic hit. And we can see the necrophilic tendencies playing out before our eyes, very tragically, in valuing some groups more than others, in willingness to sacrifice lives that have been devalued, whether they be those of people who pack our meat or the elderly, a willingness to sacrifice others' lives for one's own valued economic profit. And in this, individual liberties, to go where you want, to not wear a mask, to refuse to socially distance, to carry arms into the square, are pitted against concerns for the welfare of the collective. And we've been seeing this play out across the streets of the United States, where words that we're very used to using in one context, like liberation, which is often understood as a social act, a social possibility, where my liberation is dependent upon your liberation, which is dependent upon the health and welfare of the ecosystem. Now, liberation is the liberation to not wear a mask, to not socially distance. And where we see those who are asking for this kind of collective solidarity linked to Hitler in a very strange inversion. In May, Ibram Kendi in The Atlantic differentiated between the freedom to and the freedom from, seeing them as two essentially different conceptions of liberty that have plagued the US since slavery. The slaveholder asserted freedoms that harmed others. Kendi says, the freedom to enslave, the freedom to disenfranchise, to exploit, to impoverish, to demean and to silence and kill the demeaned, the freedom to harm, which to say in coronavirus terms, the freedom to infect. And he differentiates this from freedom from. Those who sought freedom from valued communal freedom over individual liberty. Freedom from slavery, disenfranchisement, from exploitation, from poverty, and from all the demeaning and silencing and killing. The freedom from harm, which is to say, in coronavirus terms, the freedom from infection. So he very starkly links with what I'm trying to express about necrophilia as a love of death, and biophilia, a love of life. He's connecting those with freedom to infect versus the freedom from infection. Now, the other pole that Fromm was trying to describe for us is what he called biophilia. And it too is a basic orientation. And it's not that in our lives, any of us have 100% biophilic orientation or 100% necrophilic. We're really quite a mixture of these orientations and ethics. But when the pandemic hit, we also saw an outpouring of this biophilic orientation that springs from our love of life, our sense of its sacredness and our commitment to protecting it. We saw neighbors trying to help each other, people volunteering at food banks, people who were retired healthcare workers going back into hospitals at the risk of their own contagion. Yo-Yo Ma encouraging musicians to share across boundaries, borders, and walls. Fromm says, a love of life is contagious. It communicates itself without words, explanations, and certainly without any preaching. It can be observed in the whole atmosphere of a person or group. Warm, affectionate contact with others during infancy, freedom and absence of threats, teaching by example rather than by preaching of the principles conducive to inner harmony and strength, guidance in the art of living, stimulating influence of and response to others, what Peter called response ableness, a way of life that is genuinely interesting. And he says at the heart of a biophilic orientation is a deep reverence for life. Exactly what I was not hearing from what the folks at Adelanto have experienced. Love for life will develop most, says Fromm, in a society where there is security in the sense that the most basic material conditions for a dignified life are not threatened. justice in the sense that nobody can be an end for the purposes of another, and freedom in the sense that each man has the possibility to be an active and responsible member of society. So in order to aim toward this biophilic vision, we need to better understand the freedom too that has been taken and which continues to assert itself. The freedom to violently uproot people from their homes and land and force them into slavery or servitude, or in the present into forced migration. The freedom to prohibit neighbors from helping one another, as we're witnessing on the southern border of the US, where people like Scott Warren and No Mas Muertes, no more deaths, have been criminalized for putting out water and food for migrants, where Texas citizens have been criminalized for picking up migrants who are very ill on the side of the road and taking them to the hospital. We have to understand where the freedom to surveil, police, and falsely imprison subjugated populations came from historically, and where this freedom to keep out those deemed undesirable issued from historically. So I'm going to try to take a step back and look at how freedom to began to assault what we call commons in Ireland and England, and entrench itself as a very necrophilic orientation at the roots of colonialism and imperialism. But first, what are commons? Commons, when we talk about in England and Ireland, the enclosure, the commons referred to those lands that are used and sustained for the common good. It's land that's not owned by an individual. Early stewardship of commons involved not only appropriate use, but also obligations and duties, ensuring sharing and sustainability. Commoning rights included being able to pasture one's animals, gather firewood and construction materials, and glean food and seeds that were left behind, often for the benefit of those who most needed them. So there was a sensibility about your neighbors, that you knew some neighbors needed some food, for instance, or seeds that they didn't have. So you didn't take everything that you were able to take. You left things for others. According to Gary Snyder, the poet, the commons was an ancient mode of both protecting and managing the wilds of self-governing regions. The land belonged to the local community members, and they belonged to the land. The commons, he says, is a level of organization of human society that includes the non-human. The level above the local is the bioregion. So this way of thinking about the commons has analogs in many different societies. In Peruvian indigenous thought, it would be called the Ailu. Certainly when the Puritans came to New England, they found that Native Americans had another idea about the commons that they called the common pot. But unfortunately and sadly, they didn't take time to learn what that was all about. The enclosure of the commons occurred from the 16th to 18th centuries. And I want to tell you a few stories about it. I had the opportunity during the early 2000s. I was, as I said, studying the US-Mexico wall. It was going up apace after 9/11, abrogating every environmental regulation in order to build the wall and to force migrants into the most desperate areas of Arizona to cross into the US. And so I was actually able to visit a number of walls throughout the world. And one of the walls I went to was in Derry. It's a freestanding, it's a rare intact city wall built by the English and Scottish settlers between 1613 and 1619. And what I was struck by there was that these settlers came armed and by force of violence took Irish off their land, outlawed their languages and their customs, reduced them to servitude, disallowed certain aspects of their religion, and disallowed them from entering into the wall that they built around the area that was originally, of course, an Irish settlement. This pattern of moving people off their land, forcibly making sure that they don't practice their own customs and language, and reducing them to serve one's own interests was a pattern that the British perfected in Ireland and then took to many, many other places in the context of colonialism and imperialism. There's a description by the Bishop of Meath sometime later about what these moments were like when people were forced off their land. And I'm going to read it to you. 700 human beings were driven from their homes in one day. This is an example of an enclosure of a commons. And they were set adrift on the world to gratify the caprice of one who, before God and man, probably deserved less consideration than the last and least of them. The horrid scenes I then witnessed, I must remember all my life long. The wailing of women, the screams, the terror, the consternation of children, the speechless agony of honest industrial men wrung tears of grief from all who saw them. I saw officers and men of a large police force who were obliged to attend on the occasion, cry like children at beholding the cruel sufferings of the very people whom they would be obliged to butcher had they offered the least resistance. The landed proprietors in a circle all around, and for many miles in every direction, warned their tenantry with threats of their direct vengeance against the humanity of extending to any of them the hospitality of a single night's shelter. And in little more than 3 years, nearly a fourth of them lay quietly in their graves. Now I want to underline here the outlawing by force of hospitality and mutual aid. One's own life was threatened if you responded to the needs of a neighbor. The capacity and courage to respond to the neighbor, the stranger, the animal, the earth are crucial to the building and sustaining of the commons. And so it was very clear to those who were enclosing the commons that you had to make this a criminal offense. So as people were moved off the land in England, because as we know, the tactics of colonialism bled back into the societies from which they arose. And as people were moved off their land and moved into the cities, we saw the rise of industrialism. Many people had to take extremely low-paid wages in the early factories, and many were unable to find housing or to be able to support themselves. And so vagrancy became criminalized, and one was either put into the poorhouse, a new institution, or another new institution, the prison. People who were deemed poor were separated into those who were the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And the deserving poor were shipped back to where they came. But there was a problem because they could no longer exist where they were, where they had come from. And so many of the, quote, deserving poor became the undeserving poor, were imprisoned, and then were shipped to the US and later to Australia as indentured servants. What I want to underscore here is that the erasing of the commons required two kinds of walls. Walls to keep people out, as in Derry. You enclose the commons, and then you have to make sure people don't creep back in, because you want to use that land for pasturing. You use that land, you take all the timber away, as was done in Ireland and in many parts of England, to build the Navy, the British Navy, to build the cities. So you need to be able to wall people out. We see this in the walling out that happens at our border, our southern border, and which is happening throughout the world at national borders in the face of forced migration of millions and millions of people. And you also need to be able to wall people in. And so prisons and poorhouses began. So then, as I go in the timeline of my own thinking, we had the brutal murder of George Floyd. And I began to read into the history of policing. And the reason why I gave you this early history about the commons and colonialism, imperialism, is that what I've begun to understand about the history of policing is that it's intimately linked to the enclosure of commons and the rise of colonialism. So in the 18th century, the rise of policing was tied to slavery, colonialism, and the control of the new industrial working class. And many of the insights I'm going to share here are from a book that was actually offered for free after George Floyd's killing by Verso Press, and I highly recommend it, by Alex Vitale, called The End of Policing. He says the first formal police was in Paris, and they were charged with having, quote, each and every one live according to their station and their duties. In other words, the first police in Paris policed the class structure. In England, the first full-time uniformed police was in 1829, and Robert Peel is considered the father of modern policing. And why police in England are called bobbies is from Bobby Peel's name. But what I found fascinating and actually deeply disturbing was that before he created the police in London, he was in charge of managing the British colonial occupation of Ireland. And there, Vitale says, he sought new forms of social control that would allow for continued political and economic domination in the face of growing insurrections, riots, and political uprisings. These forms of social control included the embedding themselves in activist communities, which we've seen happen in the last years, and actually many years before now as well, identifying and then killing the ringleaders. This London model of policing was imported to Boston in 1838, and it replaced the militias. And I want to say a little bit more about Boston and New England before this moment. When the Puritans came, they brought a practice from this policing of excluding people from the commons. And that was when strangers came to town, you were not allowed to take a stranger into your house. If you did, you could be expelled from your village. The village did not want to take economic responsibility for people who were coming through who might be in need. So in Boston, there was a category of occupation called warners. And warners would walk around Boston and ask people, had they seen anybody they did not recognize? And if a person had, the warner would search them out and would give them a certain number of days before they needed to move on out of Boston. And if they did not move out by those days, they were imprisoned. So these very early things that we see happening in the 1600s and 1700s in England were brought straight from England into New England. Vitali says, the reality is that the police exist primarily as a system for managing and even producing inequality by suppressing social movements and tightly managing the behaviors of poor and non-white people, those on the losing end of economic and political arrangements. Bailey argues that policing emerged as a new political and economic formations developed, producing social upheavals that could no longer be managed by existing private, communal, and informal processes. And this can be seen in the earliest origins of policing, which were tied to three basic social arrangements of inequality in the 18th century: slavery, colonialism, and the control of a new industrial working class. So in this quote, New World, we see slave patrols, which were common in places like Barbados. White Barbadians, slaveholders, settled North Carolina and South Carolina and brought the practices of slave patrols into the South. Those slave patrols became morphed into the policing in New Orleans. And they were, of course, designed to make sure that those who had been enslaved could not leave certain geographical area. They could not carry arms. They could not learn to read or write. They had to essentially stay in their place of enslavement under threat of death. So I want to underscore that in the South, these slave patrols morphed into what we call police. On the southern border, in 1848, after the US-Mexican War, which delivered to the US vast areas of Mexico, the Texas Rangers arose to police, and that policing involved more forcible mass displacement of Mexican and Mexican Americans whom they wanted to see move across the new border in order to make that area a place for white settlement. And just as in the policing in the South that came out of slave patrols where there was overlapping membership with the KKK, this was also true with the Texas Rangers, who were implicated in a number of the more than 500 lynchings of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in order to terrorize communities in the Southwest, Mexican communities in the Southwest, to move across this new border. These Texas Rangers morphed into the Border Patrol, and that Border Patrol is what we now know as ICE, and it has been the largest growing area of policing in the United States, with now more than 40,000 Border Patrol agents who are policing not only at the border, but throughout the US, and as I shared before, in a number of, throughout US cities. And that agency is being consulted by national policing and border agencies throughout the world to be able to build walls against forced migration, which you can see here with the red lines. So I want to take a quick shift and say, what might our students and alumni be offering of a biophilic nature to build commons that have to do with the freedom from rather than the freedom to? And I want to bring highlights to a few people to give you ideas about what the public practice of psychology might look like. This is Liz DeLigio, and she did her work, her field work, and her dissertation work with the Chicago Torture Justice Center which was a center that was developed after 20 years of police torture under Police Lieutenant John Burge in Chicago, who would round up African Americans, torture them to the point of confessing crimes, the majority of which they never committed. They were falsely imprisoned, many of them. And once this was exposed, this center has been established. It's worthwhile noting in my earlier history that John Burge had been involved in the Vietnam War and in policing in Vietnam. She was critical in trying to imagine ways that with the community where their post-traumatic stress could be dealt with in a very dignified and communal fashion rather than being individualized into solely individual psychotherapy, and where the men were repositioned as teachers, as not, former criminals, but as men to be able to teach their communities about state-inflicted violence. One of our stars is Harry Grammer, who's a Obama Fellow and also a CNN hero who had spent 5 years of his own young life in youth probation, who has dedicated himself to the vast network of youth offenders in LA, created a charter school for them upon their release, and a center called New Earth, where young people who have been imprisoned by the criminal justice system and are released can find wraparound services and dignified, respectful, dialogical, and loving modes of being with one another. Lizzie Rodriguez has been critical in Santa Barbara in building a network of restorative justice opportunities in our schools, our courts, and she is presently working as a fire and police commissioner. I heard from her this morning, actually. She's been able to create changes in our community so that their communications are now also in Spanish, where incapacitated mental health professionals are dispatched to homeless encampments along with police, which is really critical. She's been influential in creating and conducting implicit bias trainings for police and in holding restorative mediation with people who have been incarcerated, restorative mediation between police and those who have been incarcerated. Maricela Morales, who graduated from our counseling program, is the executive director of CAUSE, the most important Latino immigrant justice NGO in this area, in Santa Barbara, Ventura, and the Central Coast, and is at the forefront of creating solidarity around living wages, environmental justice, and rights for undocumented workers, as well as safe working places for farm workers. Alyssa Ordonez, who's writing her dissertation in the Community Indigenous Liberation Ecopsychology specialization, is now the lead in Santa Monica's regional collaboration on homelessness, and worked very closely with Mayor Garcetti on homelessness in Los Angeles during her coursework at Pacifica. And she has just been an incredible human being in going directly to the homeless and partnering with them to bring to the table their needs to help bring their voices forward in the kinds of plans that are necessary to address this real shame in our communities. And last, I'll mention Kwame Scruggs, who is another of our stars. He graduated from the Mythological Studies program and formed a youth initiative in Ohio called Alchemy Inc. that works with African American young people using mythological stories to help them understand not only their identity, but their challenges through the lens of myth and image. I think that's where I'll begin to end here, because I want to open this up to some questions. But I want to pose to you, if we come back around to Fanon's quote, to pose to you the possibility that the kind of work you could do at Pacifica could help prepare you to create small commons. Gary Snyder's calls our efforts at Commons creating little mosaics, little places, public home places, biophilic places, whether it's with Alchemy Inc. or with a group of homeless or working side by side with youth, to create spaces where this open door of our consciousness can be exercised and held open. The great philosopher Jacques Derrida talks about that there's a place inside of us, in each of us, in the home of our soul. In the home of our soul, inside, there's a locked door. The only way we are able to unlock that door inside our innermost being is through hospitality to the other, through accompaniment of the other. And the work of psychology, mythological studies, and the humanities has everything to do with our being able to live in such a way that that inner door of our own soul can be held open. So I'm going to stop here and see what questions are happening or comments. I'm really open to either or. Jessica?
Hello, everyone. So in these last few minutes, we're going to start taking questions. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A box. So if you could type any questions into that box, we will start taking questions for Dr. Mary Watkins in relation to her talk today. And then again, later, if there are any questions for admissions, you will have the opportunity to ask any questions in our student services panel today from 2 to 3.
Don't be shy. You may have a comment that you want to make. Please share it with us.
It looks like we have a few thank yous, just a few people saying thank you for the inspiring talk and sharing the wisdom. Oh, this is a good question. Somebody wants to know, can you talk about what sustains you in this challenging work?
Well, you know, I just shared with you these cameos of some students. They're just a very small fraction of our students and alumni who are involved in work that is so beautiful. And there's a paradox involved in this kind of work that I will underscore, and that is that when you're working in a very difficult setting, and I'll use detention centers as one of those, I can be having like a really, you know, a talk that's like deeply disheartening about human beings, what human beings do to one another. But I'm in a setting with this person, not the larger setting. The larger setting is really unbelievable. It's unbelievable to me that architects would use their skills to build such a place. But within this room, the two of us, and sometimes a translator, there's a depth of connection that has a certain beauty and joy alongside and right in the middle of our talk of the terrible things that have happened to this person. And one person I mentioned who may be on listening today, Lizzie Rodriguez, she and I go to Lompoc Federal Penitentiary, and we do Alternatives to Violence program groups there with the men. And it's the same situation there, where you're in a room with 20 to 30 men who have often, you know, done very, very difficult and bad things in their lives, but who have turned around their lives and are in the process of turning around their lives, and begin to share with each other at such a deep and moving level what they went through as children, what they're going through as men, being in there, hearing that their mother's been buried and not being able to be there, having their child graduate from high school and not being able to be there, knowing that the moment they get out of having served their federal time, they're going to be deported and never reunited with their children and family. So there's this what feeds the energy to do the work is both the depth of connection with those you're working with and the vision that you hold. What's very clear is that police abolition, prison abolition, and ICE abolition, and it goes way beyond getting rid of police, prisons, and detention centers. It has to do with building the social structures and the relationships of mutual aid in our community that would enable us to do without these institutions, which after all are not that old. And I underline that because the whole institution of ICE is only 20 years old. When people think, well, we can't do without ICE. Well, we did without ICE before. And prisons and policing, 400 or 500 years old. These things were dealt with within communities in very different ways than what we have now created. So I would say the two answers are the depth of connection and the vision of what you see as possible, not only in the future, but in the present, in the incredible examples that people are using. I call them prefigurative examples, because in the present, they're showing us what it could look like in the future on a wider scale. Thank you for that question. Any other questions?
Yes, so we have a couple people asking if you can speak a little bit more about the idea of defunding the police and expanding more on that topic. And also, are there examples of alternative models in different cultures that you can see working and that you can see our country moving toward?
Yes, thank you. So I'm gonna, as I said, I highly recommend this book by Alex Vitale on the end of policing. The first two chapters are a history of policing, and then he goes into what does policing do in an issue like homelessness? What does it do in an issue when people have mental illness? What does it do with people involved in the sex trade? I.e., he's taking all those issues where policing has been expanded gradually to take care of all these social conditions that really should have nothing whatsoever to do with policing. And he first goes through what they currently do, what the reforms have looked like. So for instance, the one that Lizzie mentioned in her letter to me this morning was mental health people going along with police to homeless encampments. Eventually, we might not think that the police going along is the best idea. There are many things that can better be done by people with different kinds of training. And so after describing the reforms in each of those categories, he describes those places where there have been true alternatives offered in the United States and elsewhere. So really feeding our vision of what it could look like. Let's say if by and large policing wasn't a part of mental health. There are rare instances where it needs to be, but most instances it does not need to be, and it ends up quite badly. So yes, we need to look to restorative justice frameworks that are prevalent in Australia, in Canada, in parts of Africa, in indigenous communities in the United States, and which are now being used in many places in the United States, which are diverge from a retributive model of punishment and try to put people perpetrators and victims back into conversation with them, or the families back into conversation with each other, where there can be person-to-person addressing and taking of responsibility and accountability, and often reparations. In this way, people who have done the wrong thing can be brought back into the society rather than walled out of the society. Last night I saw an incredible new documentary that was put out through Karuna Peacemaking about ex-white supremacist members who have formed a organization to help those trying to emerge from white supremacist organizations. And it was really very, very moving, because what these men who had been involved in murders and white supremacist extraordinarily brutal events, they found that like themselves, that these men had been really wounded in their childhood, had been abandoned, beaten, their parents had been drug addicted, they'd gone through a lot. And when they were trying to move out of these organizations, if they were met by people who actually wanted to listen to them and to love them and care for them and be with them, so they didn't go into drugs or into other ways of dealing with their own post-traumatic feelings, they could then make a transition into being teachers in their own community against hatred, something we certainly need more of. So, you know, I'm just beginning my reading into the history of policing. I was really shocked to understand, I shouldn't have been shocked, but I was, to understand that we took the brutal practices of colonialism and brought them into the hearts of our own countries, and are still enacting many of them. And that's not to say that every police person is involved in kind of brutal practices, but we're talking about the structures and how to make sure that policing is something for freedom for, rather than freedom to. A lot of the early history in the United States of policing, say in 1800s, took the kinds of things that had been learned in Ireland and also in the Philippines, in the occupation of the Philippines, into suppressing strikes of miners and others who were simply asking for better working conditions and shorter working hours. So we have to look clearly at what are the functions of policing, which functions can be done better by people trained otherwise, and what might a shift into restorative policing look like. And that will involve a really deep dive into the way in which we've used the expansion of prisons as a way to solve unemployment in parts of our country, certainly in California. And by putting prisons into post-industrial places where unemployment was horrible, we've now involved millions of people in walling out others. And so that there need to be better alternatives. Okay, I'm a little worried about the time. Jessica, give me some guidance.
Thank you, Dr. Watkins. So let's actually end there. Thank you so much for your questions. I wish we had more time. All right, thank you so much for joining.